that point that you just made about feeling like the Tongan person with your white family and the white person with your Tongan family, that I read a few months ago now. It's called The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, and he was the first PhD Harvard
Mm-hmm.
graduate.
Yep.
He was the first Black PhD Harvard graduate, and it's essentially the sociological journey through the South as it emerged from slavery. And he's going through as a teacher and recounting the things that had happened to these families and why they were in this state of perpetual poverty. And a point that he makes early on in the book is that the Black community is often in a purgatory between the decision of being Black and living and being American, essentially. And that really struck me. And I'm still not sure exactly why that struck me, but it really hit me deep. And I'm still trying to figure out why that hit me so deep, and maybe why, in my personal ignorance, I feel that there shouldn't be as much as of a disconnect between those two. But I understand that there is a disconnect between those two, and I would love to hear your perspective on that, because that's something that, like I said, I'm still trying to work through it. I don't understand exactly what that means or why it made me feel the way that it did.
Yeah, so Ibram X. Kendi, the best book, I read it, I finished reading it right before we chatted, and I was like, I need to talk to someone about this. And it was, what's it called? Stamped from the Beginning. One of the best books I've ever read. And he has it follows 5 people through history from the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade to Barack Obama. And yeah, he has it follows 5 different people. I think the second guy is W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's quite heavy reading, so I don't remember everything from it, but you get a lot of ideas from it. But yeah, Du Bois talked about this duality between being Black and being American. And in some of the conversations we had with the UBIAA, we had a couple Indigenous guys speaking, and one of them was saying, I struggle between, he's on the volleyball team at Old, saying, like, I struggle holding on to my Indigenous identity, and then I guess you would say Canadian. Mm-hmm. And ideally, yes, we would like to be both, or they would like to be one and be comfortable within each other. But being Indigenous in Canada, how can you be proud to be Canadian or be comfortable in that when it's still not okay or safe to do that in our society? Mm-hmm. Growing up in New Zealand, it's interesting being in Canada where people have no prejudice against Polynesians or Pacific Islanders because there's just none here. So when I meet people, they're kind of like, what are you? Like, are you Spanish? Or, you know what I mean? Whereas growing up in New Zealand, I went to a white middle school. And if you saw it, you probably think it was a private school. We had gray uniforms. You pull your socks up to your knees. If they weren't up, we had this deputy principal man, Mr. Crumpton, and he would scream at you if your socks weren't up. And you used to put like an elastic band underneath the sock and then fold it over the top so that it wouldn't fall down. Mr. Crumpton, I think he's still there, and I really hope he's calmed down, because that was not good for his blood pressure, man.
That's such a totalitarian name.
It was nuts.
Mr. Crumpton.
Mr. Crumpton, yeah. He was British too. And so, I mean, honestly, by, let's just say, Calgary standards, that school is pretty diverse, but still majority white and in a quite nice area of Auckland. And I always would try to make a point that I wasn't like those other islanders. I would try to speak more white and even put down islanders. I have big legs, like I have big calves, big quads, and I always wanted my legs to be skinny, like the white boys. I thought it looked better. It's just, um, it's weird, man. And then I went to Penrose High School, which is like a decile 2 school. If you were white, you were in the heavy minority. Like, yeah, mostly islanders. Then we had a lot of South Asians, all types. And then I had to stop being so white because I was getting beaten up. you know, a little different in New Zealand. The duality, I think, in the States and with Canada. Actually, no, the Māori in New Zealand have all very similar stories, Indigenous peoples across the world. So, yeah, it's tough. I think we talked about it too. You hardly ever see an Indigenous person in Canada with a Canadian flag, unless they played for Canada.
Mm-hmm.
It's like how that flag for an Indigenous person here just represents so much more than national pride. How can you be proud of that? Now we have all these children turning up in mass graves that Indigenous people have been talking about or have known. Now we just have some statistics to go with it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I definitely think that as it stands, the idea of patriotism as an Indigenous person, they're very conflicting ideologies. As you said, how are you patriotic of a colonial inquisition that came in and created or orchestrated mass genocides, and particularly of the Indigenous youth? That you're the 100 215 in Kamloops. I'm not sure what the other ones are, but I know that there are a lot of investigations going on that are going to turn up far more as the time goes on. So I think that that's something that we really have to, I just think there has to be conversation around that as well. There has to be conversation between those two. I talked to Dalton Sinoski, and he's a Métis teacher out of Saskatchewan, and something that we touched on a little bit towards the end is the civilization that we live in right now is likely one of the freest that's ever existed, and particularly in Canada, and I mean North America in general, Europe, but there's no outright slavery. Slavery's been around since the beginning of humankind, essentially, and we live in a very free time, and we're the wealthiest that humans have ever been, and there are all these things that are going so well for us, and at the same time there are these things that they're horrible historic atrocities and ongoing oppression that continues to impact groups of people, which it's tough to talk about those two in the same vein. It's tough to say we're some of the luckiest human beings to exist right now in the place that we exist, and also there are these horrible things that have happened, and we have to reconcile that, and we have to come to terms with those issues, and we have to have an open discussion about them, and we have to educate people on them. And I think that so often people just throw themselves into one of those two groups. Either everything's great, shut up, and horrible things have happened and continue to happen, and nothing is good. I'm going to try this again. There was a poem that I tried to read off when I was having my conversation with Dalton, and I'll try to do it again. It's by Charles Dickens, and it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that the noisiest of its authorities insisted on its being perceived for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. And I think that that perfectly encapsulates the zeitgeist that we live in right now, where people are on either side of that. And as you said, in our last discussion, there's no touching of the circles of ideology right now. We're not at a Venn diagram. We're circles on either side of a spectrum. And I think a big part of that might be language, which is something that I wanted to touch on a little bit today, and the language that we use and how it's evolving potentially faster than the emotion can catch up with it.